It was one of those crisp autumn afternoons when the wind carried the scent of fallen leaves, and the streets were quiet, except for the occasional rustling of trees. Daniel, a 12-year-old boy with a heart bigger than his small frame, tightened his grip on the warm container of soup his mother had packed. The steam seeped through the lid, fogging up the plastic slightly, as he walked toward Mrs. Henderson's house. Mrs. Henderson had lived in the neighborhood for as long as Daniel could remember. She was the quiet, elderly woman who always sat on her porch in the evenings, watching the world go by with soft, knowing eyes. People said she had lived alone ever since her husband passed away years ago. She wasn't the kind to complain or ask for help, but Daniel's mother had noticed she hadn't come outside in days. Concerned, she made a pot of homemade chicken soup and asked Daniel to take it over. Daniel didn't mind. He liked Mrs. Henderson. She always had a kind smile for him, and on Halloween, she gave out full-size chocolate bars when most people handed out tiny ones. But today, as he approached her house, a strange feeling settled in his stomach. Her curtains were drawn tight, and the mailbox was overflowing with letters, some of which had fallen onto the small porch. He knocked gently on the door and waited. No response. He knocked again, this time louder. A long moment passed before he finally heard a faint shuffle from inside. Then, a slow creaking sound as the door cracked open just an inch. Mrs. Henderson peered out, her eyes tired and her face paler than usual. "Oh, Daniel," she said weakly, as if even speaking took effort. "Hi, Mrs. Henderson," Daniel said, offering a small smile. "My mom made you some soup. She thought you might not be feeling well." The old woman hesitated before finally unlatching the chain and pulling the door open a little wider. "That's very kind of her. And of you," she said softly. Her voice had lost its usual warmth, replaced with something fragile. Daniel stepped inside just enough to hand her the container, and for the first time, he got a glimpse of the house. It was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old books and something else, something musty, like untouched corners of an attic. The living room, which he had only seen glimpses of from the outside before, was cluttered with stacks of papers, unopened envelopes, and faded photographs. The air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves carried memories too heavy to be spoken aloud. Mrs. Henderson took the soup with trembling hands. "Thank you, dear. This means more than you know." Daniel shifted on his feet. "Do you need anything else? I can help if you want." She gave a weak chuckle. "You're a sweet boy, but I'll be fine." Even as she said it, Daniel wasn't so sure. Something about the way she looked at him, as if she wanted to say more, but couldn't bring herself to, made him hesitate. He wanted to ask if she was really okay, but before he could, she gave him a small nod, a silent way of telling him it was time to go. "All right," Daniel said slowly. "I'll come check on you later, okay?" She smiled faintly. "That would be nice." With that, he turned and walked back down the porch, but the uneasy feeling didn't leave him. He had expected Mrs. Henderson to be grateful, maybe even happy, that someone had thought of her, but instead, she looked afraid, as if something weighed on her more than just being sick. That night, Daniel lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind kept replaying the moment when she opened the door, the darkness behind her, the way her voice wavered. Something wasn't right. He could feel it. The next day, as soon as school let out, he told his mom he was going to check on Mrs. Henderson again. This time, he brought an extra loaf of bread along with more soup, just in case. When he reached her house, that same uneasy silence hung in the air. But something was different. The front door was open, not just unlocked, wide open. Daniel froze. his pulse quickening. He stepped closer, peering inside. "Mrs. Henderson," he called out, but there was no answer. His stomach tightened. He knew he shouldn't go in. His mom always told him never to enter someone's house without permission. But something inside him, some deep, unshakable instinct, told him he needed to check. He took a cautious step over the threshold. The air inside was colder than before. The same clutter remained, but something had changed. Papers that had been stacked neatly were now scattered on the floor. The chair where Mrs. Henderson had been sitting yesterday was empty, a blanket draped over the armrest, as if she had left in a hurry. Daniel's breath came quicker. "Mrs. Henderson," he tried again. Still nothing. Then, from deeper inside the house, he heard it. A faint sound, a whisper, a movement. He couldn't tell, but whatever it was, he wasn't alone. Daniel stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway. His breath caught in his throat. The house felt different now, colder, heavier, as if it were holding its breath along with him. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to move forward. His sneakers barely made a sound against the wooden floor as he took cautious steps deeper into the house. Something wasn't right. He glanced around, taking in every detail. The furniture sat untouched, yet the room had an eerie sense of disorder. A chair was slightly pulled out from the table, as if someone had left in a hurry. A framed picture lay face down on a shelf. And then there was the stack of mail. Papers that had once been neatly piled were now scattered across the floor, like a gust of wind had swept through. Daniel's fingers clenched around the container of soup he still held. His heart pounded in his chest, loud enough that he was sure if someone else were here, they could hear it too. "Mrs. Henderson." His voice barely rose above a whisper this time. Silence, then a sound, faint but unmistakable. A shuffle, coming from the back of the house. Daniel's skin prickled. He hesitated for only a second before stepping toward the noise. His instincts told him to run, to leave and tell his mother. But something deeper pushed him forward. Mrs. Henderson had looked afraid the last time he saw her. What if she was in trouble? His hands trembled as he reached the end of the hallway. The door to the back room was slightly ajar, revealing just a sliver of darkness beyond it. He could hear his own breathing, fast, unsteady, as he pushed it open. Inside, the room was small, filled with old wooden furniture and the scent of time itself. A single lamp cast a dim glow, barely reaching the corners. But what caught Daniel's attention wasn't the room. It was the old woman sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mrs. Henderson." He exhaled in relief, stepping inside. She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't noticed him standing there. Her expression shifted. First surprise, then something unreadable. "Daniel," she murmured. "You shouldn't be here." His relief faded into confusion. "I called for you. The door was open. I thought—" He stopped, looking around. "What happened? Are you okay?" For a moment, she didn't answer. Her hands gripped the fabric of her dress, her fingers pale against the dark material. The silence stretched between them before she finally spoke. Her voice barely above us, whisper, "There are things that you don't understand, dear." Daniel frowned. "Like what?" Mrs. Henderson shook her head, glancing to the window as if she expected someone to be watching. "I didn't mean for you to get involved." His chest tightened. Involved in what? Another noise interrupted them, this time from outside. A faint rustling, the sound of footsteps on fallen leaves. Daniel turned his head sharply toward the window. He couldn't see much through the curtains, but the shadowy movement outside sent a chill down his spine. Someone was out there. Mrs. Henderson's hands gripped his wrist suddenly, her touch colder than he expected. "Listen to me, Daniel. You need to go home." But No. Her voice was firm now, her fingers tightening. You're a good boy. You don't need to be caught up in this. Daniel stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. Caught up in what? Why was she acting like this? Then a louder sound. The front door creaked. Daniel felt his heartbeat slam against his ribs. Someone had just stepped inside. Mrs. Henderson's grip loosened, her expression shifting into something that sent a different kind of fear through Daniel. Resignation, like she had been expecting this. The air in the house grew impossibly still, and then a voice, low, steady, coming from the front of the house. Mrs. Henderson, the voice called. It's been a long time. Daniel's body locked up. He didn't recognize the voice, but something about it sent a wave of unease through him. Mrs. Henderson's shoulders dropped slightly, her breath coming out in a quiet sigh. Go, Daniel, now. But Daniel couldn't move. He was too scared to. He heard the slow, deliberate steps, moving closer, each one measured, unhurried. Whoever it was, they weren't afraid of being heard. Then, the footsteps stopped, right outside the room. Daniel's heart slammed against his chest as the door handle began to turn. The door handle turned slowly, and Daniel felt his entire body tense. He didn't breathe, didn't move. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears as the door creaked open inch by inch. A tall figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. Daniel instinctively took a step back, his fingers gripping the edge of his jacket. The man standing there was older, maybe in his late 50s, dressed in a long, dark coat. His face was partially shadowed, but his sharp eyes locked onto Mrs. Henderson immediately. Hello, Margaret, the man said in a calm, unsettling voice. Mrs. Henderson didn't flinch. She just exhaled, as if she had been expecting this. You shouldn't be here, she said quietly. The man took another step forward. I was wondering how long you could keep hiding. His gaze flickered to Daniel, and for the first time, there was a shift in his expression, mild surprise. And who's this? Daniel swallowed hard, but didn't speak. Mrs. Henderson straightened her shoulders, her frail hands clenched into fists. Just a boy who was kind enough to bring me soup, she said, her voice steady. He has nothing to do with this. The man studied Daniel for a long moment, then gave a slow, knowing smile. That's so. He looked back at Mrs. Henderson. You know why I'm here, Margaret. There's no use pretending. Daniel's eyes darted between them, his mind racing. He had no idea what was happening, but he could feel the tension crackling in the air like a coming storm. Mrs. Henderson inhaled deeply. Then, to Daniel's shock, she took a shaky step forward. I have nothing left, she said softly. You've already taken everything from me. The man's face remained unreadable. You still have something I need. Daniel saw Mrs. Henderson's hands trembling slightly, but she didn't step back. You won't find it here. A tense silence filled the room. The man's fingers twitched at his side, and for a moment, Daniel thought he was going to do something bad. But then, without warning, the man let out a quiet chuckle. Maybe not, he admitted, but I always check, just in case. He took one last look around the room before shifting his eyes back to Daniel. You should be careful who you help, kid. Sometimes kindness gets you mixed up in things you don't understand. Daniel didn't dare speak, but he held the man's gaze. Refusing to look away, the man seemed amused by that. He turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps slow and deliberate. At the doorway, he paused. I'll be seeing you, Margaret. And just like that, he was gone. Daniel barely realized he had been holding his breath until he let out a shaky exhale. He turned to Mrs. Henderson, his mind buzzing with 100 questions. Who was that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Henderson sat down on the edge of the bed, looking smaller than before. "An old mistake," she murmured. Daniel frowned. "Is he going to come back?" She gave a sad smile. "Probably. He hesitated. Do you need help? Should we tell someone?" Mrs. Henderson reached out and gently patted his hand. "You've done more for me than you know, Daniel. But some things can't be fixed." Daniel didn't like that answer. He didn't like any of this. But he could see in her tired eyes that there was a past here, one he couldn't fully understand. That night, when Daniel went home, he told his mother everything. She listened carefully, her face growing serious. She promised to check on Mrs. Henderson herself to make sure she was safe. Days passed, then a week. The leaves continued to fall. The air grew colder. But Mrs. Henderson's house remained the same, quiet, distant. Daniel checked in every few days, but she never mentioned the man again. Then, one morning, she was gone. Her house was empty. The curtains that had once been drawn tight were now open, revealing rooms that had been cleared out. No furniture, no stacks of papers, just emptiness. A "for sale" sign stood in the yard. Daniel stood on the sidewalk, staring at it, feeling something heavy settle in his chest. He hadn't even gotten to say goodbye. His mother later told him that Mrs. Henderson had moved away. No one knew where. As the days passed, Daniel found himself thinking about her often, about the look in her eyes that day, about the strange man, about the way she had said, "Some things can't be fixed." But he didn't believe that, because if there was one thing he had learned, it was that even in the middle of something he didn't understand, kindness still mattered. Maybe it didn't fix everything. Maybe it didn't erase the past. But sometimes, just sometimes, it was enough to remind someone they weren't alone.